This is the lecture for Ancient and Medieval History for Thursday, the 19th of December, 2024. I'm recording this in case I get tuckered out because I'm a little sick still. And I'm going to have to do this lecture for all three of my ancient history classes. So, hi, you at home. Hi, you here. So all of this is going to be on the exam, and so you should have your notes out to the last page of Greek history, because I'm going fast. I won't have much time for questions today, because tomorrow is your exam, and it must be done. So, first off, why does all war happen? This is a flashback. All war happens because of worry over the future. There are other problems that cause wars, sure. But every war, regardless of the other details, every war starts over the question of, well, right now we can defend ourselves against our enemies and we can take them. But 20 years from now, we may be overwhelmed. So if we have to fight, let's fight them now while we have the power to do it. Anxiety over the future is what made Athens and Sparta tangle. A lion and a tiger shark have more to fight about. But the question was, would the Athenians overwhelm the Spartans or vice versa? It wasn't really over Corcyra, it was over the future. And if we end up fighting the Chinese over Taiwan within the next few years, God forbid, it will be because the Chinese want to take control of the future, and we don't want that, because they're communists, and their future is not a happy one for human beings who aren't leading members of their Politburo. So there's that. Now, when Alexander goes out and conquers, one of the things he does is goes to the city of Gordium, which has a famous knot that all the great thinkers of the world for the past 100+ years have tried to figure out. It's like the gods tied a knot and made a conundrum, and all the smarty pants around the world, the known world, the Greek world, tried to figure it out, and they couldn't. So Alexander rides up, looks at the knot, slices it asunder with his sword, goes, mischief managed, problem solved, and moves on with his life. And the people of Gordium, of course, cheer. He's just destroyed their only tourist industry. They're going to be much poorer now, and they're not going to be famous anymore. I mean, besides the Gordian Knot, whoever heard of Gordium? But they cheer because Alexander has an army. And, yeah, he's got an army and they don't want to irk him. But sometimes in life, you just got to cut through the BS. Alexander understood that, and that is the symbolism of the very real event of him slicing the Gordian Knot asunder. That is in twain. That is in half. After the Peloponnesian Wars, Greece was divided. Sparta didn't lead because it was concerned with its slaves. So you end up with a nasty backbiting in Greece, where the Greeks ultimately say better to be ruled by a goat lover like Philip of Macedon than to be ruled by those jerks from Thebes. And that bitterness helped Philip conquer Greece and helped Alexander the Great unify Greece, much in the same way that the British in India were able to appeal to a lot of Indian cooperation and support, because the Indians were embittered against one another in many ways. So the British, by being outsiders, made everyone equally subject, and it wasn't like being ruled by the Nizam of Mysore, which would just be obnoxious for everyone who wasn't already in Mysore. This is still true today, by the way. The national language of the world's largest democracy is English, even though India has been independent from the British Empire since 1947. Now, it may be a different form of English than you are used to, but it is English nonetheless. How dare I? It's comedy! Morons, woke morons. Oh, you can't make fun of Indians unless you are from India. Really? That seems racist to me. In any case, the reason that India, the world's largest democracy and the world's largest country now, bigger than China by population, because China has some population problems. The reason they use English is because the non-Hindi speakers, like the Bengalis, don't want to learn Hindi. And the Hindis don't want to learn Bengali, and they'd rather everyone learn a foreign language so everyone is equal. There's no advantage to one Indian over another. So this divisiveness is not merely an imperial dream of the British, it's very real in India even today. So Greece has that bitterness after Alexander too. And ultimately, the division between the Greek lands is going to cause wars, which is going to draw the Romans in, because the Romans don't want to deal with these squabbling Greeks. And so, 150 years after Alexander the Great, the Romans march in and take over. And as wonderful as the Spartan phalanx was, tain't nothing compared to the Roman legion. We'll talk about that after Christmas. Hellenism is a blending of the best, the ideal is the best, of Greek and Roman culture. Just like you are genetically the blending of the best of your mother and father's bloodline. I know it doesn't work that way. You get elements from your mother's bloodline and elements from your father's bloodline. But you're not, the best of the best. Evolutionary theory says that ultimately the better qualities win out, better in terms of survival. But in the case of Alexander the Great, there was a self-conscious idea to take the best of the Greeks and the best of the Persians and make something new with it. And this is why he asked his officers to marry Persian brides and have mixed-race children who would end up ruling Alexander's empire. And it's why, to this day, Hellenistic ideas like Christianity is a Hellenistic religion. It's got Eastern Jewish faith, and it's got Greek philosophy. The New Testament, the part of the Bible about Jesus, is not written in Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke. It's certainly not written in ancient Hebrew. It's written in Greek. And the Christian faith doesn't make a huge splash in the Jewish world. Most Jews don't end up believing Jesus is the Son of God. But the Greeks and the Romans do. That's where the future of Christianity is, in the lands of the Greeks and the Romans. So Hellenism, this idea of blending the best of cultures, is much more important than all the cities named for Alexander the Great, and it's much more important than Alexander's empire, which doesn't outlast him. Hellenism is alive to this day. In fact, the principle of Hellenism is behind the United States of America. Send us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. I hold my light beside the golden door. That's from the poem on the Statue of Liberty by Emma Lazarus. The United States has a heritage. We speak English for a reason. We come from the English tradition. Our idea of the Republic comes from the English tradition. But we're not all English. And the idea is that the melting pot that is the United States has people from all over the world come. And they bring what's distinctive, but they join with the wider mainstream culture. Now, this idea has been, for political reasons, sabotaged in the last couple of generations, where people talk about multiculturalism. Well, people from Ireland or Mexico or Chile or China didn't come to the United States to live like Mexico and Ireland and Chile and China. They came to live like Americans. So they bring the best of Mexico, Chile, China, and what's that fourth one I just said? Ireland. Thank you. See, I am a little out of it. They bring those things, and our culture is the richer for it. But we're not becoming Chilean, Mexican, Chinese, or Irish. They are becoming American. And this has happened with my ancestors, and it is happening with your ancestors. That is basically Hellenism writ large, that we join a broader culture that has elements from all over, but that has a core. In the case of Hellenism, the core is Greek. In the case of the United States, the core is English. Okay, so now we go into totally new ground. I got to go fast. In terms of politics, the great gift of the Athenians is demokratia. Demo is the Greek word for people. Kratia is the word for rulership. So demokratia is where the people rule. Now, Athenian democracy was described in two constitutions, one by Solon, designed to break the power of the aristocrats, and one by Cleisthenes, a later adaptation of Solon's constitution, which was designed to defeat corruption. in Pericles' funeral oration, which is in your notes, there is a description of what the Athenians thought of their democracy in the highest sense. You go in your notes, past the maps, and there's a page that looks like this. And this is actually from a textbook I used long ago, when hobbits were real. Voices from the past. Pericles' funeral oration. So, in the winter of 431 BC, Athens honored its war dead with a public funeral. Much like the Gettysburg Address. Actually, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is a look back on Pericles' funeral oration. Gettysburg Address explains why Union soldiers must risk their lives in war, 7 years ago, and all that. Well, Pericles is doing the same thing here. It's to honor the dead, but it's also to remind the living of what makes us special. So, Pericles says, in this translation, our Constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. Instead, others copy what we do. Our plans of government favor the many instead of the few. That is why it is called democracy. As for laws, we offer equal justice to everyone. As for social standing, advancement is open to everyone according to ability. High position does not depend on wealth, nor does poverty bar the way. We take pleasure in the arts, but without extravagance. We take pleasure in knowledge, but without being soft. Our public leaders have their own businesses as well as politics to take care of. Our ordinary citizens see to their own livelihoods, but are also capable of making political decisions. Unlike other nations, we Athenians do not call a man who takes no part in public life quiet or unambitious. We call such a man useless. In short, our polis is the school of all Greece. This is the Athens for which these men nobly fought and died, because they could not bear the thought of losing such a city. Anyone, any free-born man of Athens could participate in government. Anyone, any free-born man of Athens could excel and rise to the top. It wasn't easy, just like in the United States. It's not easy to go from rags to riches, but it can still happen. You can't do that easily in Germany. You can do it much more easily in the United States, but it's still hard. The idea that Athens is a place where you are defined by your choices and your words, not by your parentage, that's so huge. And we love the arts, but we're not sissies. We love knowledge, but we're not soft. We are able to do it all. We're able to be strong and athletic and warlike when we need to be, but sophisticated and thoughtful and knowledgeable when we also need to be. This is a special place, and it's worth fighting for. So that's what Pericles thought of Athens, and that's largely what the Athenians think of themselves. Any questions or comments on anything I've covered so far? I don't want to drive so fast that you don't understand what is being said. Yes, sir?
Is Athens, in a way, the basis for what America stood for or still stands for?
Question was, is Athens the basis for what Americans stand or stood for? No. It's a cautionary tale. Our founders knew very much about Athens, but they didn't trust democracy, because democracy has an inherent instability. Most people don't care enough about politics to be very vigilant, constantly watchful. There's an old saying, I think by Jefferson, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Well, most people aren't like that. So what almost always happens in a direct rule by the people is a demagogue comes along. A demagogue is somebody who tells the people what they want to hear. He gives easy answers. Oh, if you give me control, I'll save you from COVID. Not that would ever happen. And a demagogue promises the people peace and security in return for his control. And sooner or later, something's going to happen and people will stampede. The citizenry will stampede into the control of a tyrant, a dictator, a demagogue. It always happens. Instead of looking at Athens, which had a fragile democracy that succeeded for just over about 100 years, maybe 200, depending upon how you want to count it, our founders looked to Rome, and we're going to talk about the Roman Republic and why it's a much more stable model for a free society than Athens. So Athens was in the mind, and in most civics classes they call us. You'll get the politics of this. A democratic republic. See, that way everyone has a seat at the table, Democrats, Republicans. And what they argue is that we are a republic inspired by the idea of Athenian democracy, but we're not a direct democracy. We elect people to do those jobs. Good question. Thank you. Any others before we move on? Okay. So, in terms of Greece, they are the first great philosophers. Philo means love. There are many words for love in Greek. There's agape, which is sort of Christian love. There's eros, which is sexual love. And among others, there is philo, or philo, which is the love of something like beauty or knowledge, or the love of an ideal, the love of freedom, for example. So philo or philo love is the kind of love you might feel when you say the pledge, if you understand what the pledge is all about, or what you might feel when you look at a beautiful statue or read an incredible novel. It's the love, wow, look, people produced this. They must have been inspired. There must have been geniuses. The people produced this. So the love of Sophia, wisdom. So if you ever know a guy named Philo, his name means the love of an ideal. If you ever know a girl named Sophie or Sophia, her name means wisdom. So philosophia is the love of wisdom. That is philosophy. Another way of describing philosophy is thinking about the world. My wife and I have been together since January of '85. That's when we started dating. And like anyone who's been married a long time, we would never say we have the secret to a happy marriage. We have our good days and our bad days. But we've been together for a good long time. January of '85 to now. We got married in July of 1990. We've been together a while, which means that we found a way, for the most part, to work and live together happily. One of the reasons that this has worked for us is that when we argue, we usually argue about the terms that we're going to argue about. It sounds stupid. But we argue about how we're going to talk about it before we start talking about it. Why? 2 reasons. 3. 1, it's easier to talk about how you're going to talk about something than it is to talk about something you're really angry about or you're really passionate about. So it depersonalizes it. Number 2, we establish ground rules that we usually follow, and that helps us to work the problem, not rip at one another. And the third thing is we're both strange people, and it works for our psychologies. Every couple is different. Every marriage and every family is different. But this is what works for us. Philosophers do the same thing. They think about how they're going to think about the world, and then they think about the world to try to work out the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. That's what philosophers do. Now, the first group of philosophers we're going to talk about are a bunch of flim-flam men called the Sophists, the wise guys. The Sophists are men who went from city to city, going from agora to agora, making a living like a stand-up comic. Goes from town to town, from venue to venue, telling jokes and making a living, making a percentage of the take. Making a percentage of the money that's collected at the admissions ticket box. So the Sophists use philosophy as a way to make a living. And what they usually do is they encourage people, to ask questions that today a stand-up comic would ask. You ever notice, they start with something like that. Of course, right now I'm drawing a blank from all the stand-up comedians that I've enjoyed over the years. The only one that comes to mind is something George Carlin said long ago from the early 1970s. You ever notice that there aren't many Chinese fighter pilots named Rusty? Yeah, that's true. Not many Rusties among the Chinese Air Force. Because Rusty is usually a nickname given because you're a ginger. Um, just little things like that. Um, get on the plane. The hell with you. I'm getting in the plane. Little things like that. So a sophist will find interesting things about life that people think they know, but they really don't, or they haven't thought about it. But the key to the sophist is the difference between skepticism and cynicism. First, you've got the credulous rube. I tell you that it's raining cotton candy outside. And you go, wow, I didn't know it could do that. That's a person who is credulous. A credulous person is a person who tends to believe what he's told. While credulity can be useful and good to you in life when it comes to, say, your faith perhaps, or your patriotism, or your love of family members who are far from perfect, ultimately a credulous person is going to be used by cynical people. What most educated people strive for is something called skepticism. Skepticism is the idea that somebody tells me it's raining cotton candy outside. I go, well, that's an interesting assertion. And I go outside and I see what's happening. And if it's not raining cotton candy, I know this person is either a fool or very, very misguided or just a liar. But I check for myself. A skeptical person hears another person's truth and then says, that's interesting. Yeah, I'll look into it. Which is a fair and reasonable and wise thing to do. Somebody tells you something, check it out yourself if you take an interest in it. A cynic assumes that anyone who believes anyone else is a sucker. Oh, you think there's something out there called rain? You fool. How dare you assume that I'm so stupid and gullible that I'll believe in something called rain, let alone cotton candy? See, a credulous person prejudges the situation, assuming that the person talking to them is honest and perceptive. A cynic assumes that everyone who's talking to them is trying to use them or manipulate them through lies. So I think that being cynical is closed-minded because you're just being a bitter, nasty, negative jerk. Yeah, it's all conspiracies. It's all secret from behind the scenes. Yeah. No, not necessarily. There are reasons why you might think that, but there are other reasons that can explain why history happens as it does. It's not all the Bavarian Illuminati and the Gnomes of Zurich and the Bilderberger Club and the Trilateral Commission and the Freemasons and the Jews and any other hate group that you want to point out as being the secret villains behind world history. There are people who want to do that, like George Soros, but they haven't done it yet. And the likelihood is, unless we end up getting wet-wired with computer stuff, they're probably not going to succeed. A cynic prejudges as much as a highly credulous person does. But sophists market in cynicism. Sophists basically use their form of wise guy comedy to point out how foolish it is to be a person who believes things. And that can be like acid to a society. If nobody believes anything, then there's nothing that holds people together, because a culture is a group of people held together by common beliefs. Nobody has beliefs, there's no culture. In any case, the sophists do their thing, and they are somewhat important, but the truth is people figure them out. Now we come to the first of the big three of Greek philosophy, Socrates. Socrates is not a writer. The only reason we know about Socrates is because of one of his students, Plato. Plato writes about Socrates, particularly his death. Socrates was a teacher. And Socrates' idea was that we're born with all the common sense wisdom that we need. The truth is, though, most people don't think about their lives. Socrates says an unexamined life is not worth living. So how do you think about your life? Well, at the end of the day, maybe before you go to sleep, you go through your day and you figure out what was good, what was bad, what was just bizarre, what you should try to do again, what you should never try to do again, and so forth. That's examining your life. So his method is to ask questions. And these questions are going to help people to think, to make you think. Lying is bad, Socrates asks. Would you agree? And his students would say, most likely, yeah, lying is bad. Aha, Socrates says. What if your wife asks you, does my butt look big in this? Oh, no. Socrates would actually never use that example for a variety of reasons, but I'm using it because most of you get it. See, the truth is, I would tell my wife, yeah, that's not flattering, because I'm trying to help her go out into the world looking as good as she could possibly look. If I ask her how does the outfit I'm wearing look before I'm going to make a speech or something, she'll tell me if she doesn't think it works. That's honest. But there are a lot of people in a lot of relationships, it's a trick question. That's like saying, do you want to go to hell for the next half hour? As we rip each other apart with meat hooks, verbally? Does my butt look big in this? Oh, no, honey, no, you're fine. There are times in life where if you're dealing with dishonest, vainglorious, petty, little nasty people, you might want to lie. The example Socrates uses is if you've got a kid, your kid needs to take medication because he's got a terrible disease, and the kid doesn't want to take his medication. So you slip the medication into some food, and the kid's eating his porridge, and he says, hey, Dad, there's nothing in this, is there, other than, porridge and milk and stuff? And the father says, oh, no, I just a little cinnamon. He's lying through his teeth. There's medicine through that entire porridge. If the father tells the kid the truth, the kid might not eat his medicine. So the father is lying for a good purpose. There are times in life where lying might actually be the right thing to do. So Socrates is not saying lying is good. Socrates is saying, think about every prejudice you have. Every prejudgment that you have. Lying is wrong? Well, most of the time, yeah, but not always. Socrates says. Now, Socrates asked his young students, they weren't children, they were teenagers like you and older people, and think about the gods. Think about whether the stories of the gods all make sense. Think about what it means when we talk about Zeus and Hera not getting along. What's with that? What is it with Zeus and his father Kronos? And people heard about this. They heard Socrates asking his students to think about the gods. And they put him on trial for destroying the youth, their morality. By making them think about the gods, the people putting him on trial assumed that Socrates was trying to undermine religious faith and the patriotic gods. Well, there were a bunch of evidence against him. And then Socrates was given a chance to speak, and he said, look, first of all, I said what I said to make people think. Faith that's based in ignorance is weak. Faith that's based in thoughtfulness is stronger. I'm not trying to undermine anything except prejudices. What I expect and what I hope for my students to do, anyone who listens to me, is to think honestly about everything. To not take anything for granted. To run it all through your mind because you were given a mind for a reason. And I do it again. Because it's the only thing that I have to offer my students is my honesty, my integrity. And my honesty and my integrity comes from a respect for and almost a worship of the truth. Sometimes that involves painful questions and painful answers. So they found him guilty, of course. And Socrates said, don't exile me, don't ostracize me, I'm not going anywhere. I'm an Athenian. I'm an Athenian speaking the truth as I see it. And if an Athenian in the freest place on earth can't speak the truth as he sees it without fear of persecution and death, then I choose not to live. So an agreement is made, and that night Socrates has a huge party. And his students show up, and anyone who wants to show up, and they have a big time. And then Socrates, at the height of the party, drinks Hemlock, which is a deadly poison, and dies. Rather than being executed or exiled, or lying, he chooses to end his own life. And this is considered by many intellectuals to be a heroic thing, because if somebody forces you to live a lie or die in truth, that's an important question. And it's not an obvious answer. Do I live a lie? In which case, is my life worth living? If I have to die for the truth, is that the best I can hope to do? And a lot of people, for their beliefs, for their faith, have died for the truth. Whether or not Jesus was the Son of God, the only begotten Son of God, Jesus died for his truth. John the Baptist died for his truth. A lot of the religious martyrs died for their truth, because the world does not like somebody who tells the truth all the time. The truth shakes things up. It unsettles people. It causes corruption to come out into the open. It makes trouble. So what the world's powers tend to do is play whack-a-mole with the truth. Oh, you got truth, boom, 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 boom. And they whack on it until the truth either is dead, until the truth is destroyed, which never happens, or until they're overthrown, which usually happens eventually. So Socrates dies. Plato writes about it. Plato then becomes center stage in Greek philosophy. And Plato says this world of our senses is a lie. It's not necessarily the truth. The truth must be perfect. There is a creator. There is a perfect creation. And we live in a carnival mirror visage, effigy of that perfect world. Some universe, there is a perfect water, a perfect bottle, and a perfect teacher to drink it perfectly, without any crinkly plastic noises. These perfect forms are called archetypes. And these archetypes, an archetype is a Platonic perfect form. It is the best form of chair, light, eyeglasses, or whatever you could possibly have. Although there's a certain paradox in the perfect form of eyeglasses, because that assumes that there aren't perfect eyes everywhere. We live in an echo world. You go to a carnival and you see some mirrors make you look really tall and thin, and other mirrors make you look really short and fat. But that's a distortion. We live in a distortion reality. We live in an echo of the real world. So to perceive truth, you don't look at the world as it is. You learn to think systematically. Think. Systematically think about the world. Step to step to step, logically. And by thinking this way, you basically meditate on truth. You visualize truth. And that's how you encounter truth. You don't encounter truth from the real world. You encounter truth from your ability to understand how perfect forms would exist and how they would interact with one another. How they would interact with one. That's a big deal. So to Plato, the ideal concept, the theoretical concept, is much more important than anything that actually happens, because you are only seeing effects in a distorted universe with observing. The only way you understand the truth of something is you imagine it in its perfect form, interacting in an environment of perfect forms. Plato also comes up with a perfect society, which he calls republic. And in that perfect society, the job of education is to help you find your best self. If you're naturally a sculptor or a dancer or a singer or a teacher or a voyager, a navigator, a swimmer, an athlete, cook, a carpenter, what schooling will do is show you that truth and teach you to be the best carpenter, cook, or whatever it is that you are, that you possibly can be. And then you go through life doing your perfect thing. And it is ruled by a philosopher class who think about the consequences of their choices as leaders. And the ultimate ruler is called the philosopher king. Not the philosopher, although that would be the way I would call it, the philosopher king. And the philosopher king is the wisest, most thoughtful philosopher, and he's given the power of life and death, because he is given the power to change the world and make it a better place incrementally. So the republic is an idealized society where everyone becomes their best self. It's sort of like bringing the perfect world of archetypes to this world. It's never existed. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius is the closest thing we've ever seen to a philosopher king. I'll talk about him next unit. Aristotle is the last of the big three, and Aristotle is both a disciple of Plato and the teacher of Alexander the Great. And what Aristotle says is, if you want to understand giraffes, get a bunch of giraffes, observe them, or go out to where the giraffes live and observe them. Aristotle disagrees with Plato. He disputes Plato. And Aristotle's theory is the basis of what we would call the scientific method. So there is a phenomenon that we want to understand, and that phenomenon is water solidifying. So we will make a hypothesis that ice is contagious, and that once ice starts, it tends to spread like a disease. That's my hypothesis. And I'm going to design a series of experiments to test that hypothesis. And my experiments will prove me wrong. But maybe I will get a hint that it has to do with reduction of temperature to a certain point. And so I test that. And from my tests, I get the sense that, yeah, if you freeze water at 32 Fahrenheit degrees, you end up with ice. So now I have a theory which is based on experimental data, which is based on observation, which is based on a hypothesis, and that ice freezes as a result of lower temperatures. And that is the scientific method. It's applied Aristotelian philosophy. Aristotle has a Lego, those little Lego things, of logic called a syllogism. It's a three-part logic statement. General principle, specific case connected to the general principle. So here's a syllogism, the classic one. Statement 1, all men are mortal. That means all men will die. Statement 2, Socrates is a man. Statement 3, therefore Socrates is mortal. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now that is a Lego of logic. If you build an argument based on Legos of logic called syllogisms, your argument will probably be strong. It doesn't guarantee that you're right, though. My idea is that hippopotami come from eggs, and Gertrude is a hippopotamus. Therefore, Gertrude came from an egg. That is based on a false principle, unless you want to go into the ovaries of Mama Hippo, Henrietta, who, then Gertrude the hippo came from an egg. But most people, when they think of eggs, they think of like reptile eggs or bird eggs. So that is a questionable syllogism. Still, a syllogism is a Lego of logic. And logic is dispassionately understanding the world as it is, not as we want it to be. Dispassionately understanding the world as it is, rather than what we want it to be. Dispassionately understanding the world as it is, rather than the world as we want it to be. Most people have an editor in their perception of reality. I don't want to know that. I don't want to see that. Well, it doesn't matter, because it exists. Okay. Greek art in the ancient world is both idealized and realistic. It's a bit like Pericles' statue that has the male model look. Bless you. He's wearing a helmet because he's got a bulgy, disformed skull. And it's Pericles in the flower of his youth on his best day. So it's like the filters they have that can make you look different ways. Idealized realism. Looks like you, but on your best day. Now science. Eratosthenes proves the world is round, and he proves the world is a certain size. Eratosthenes has a slave. He and the slave each have a pole of a certain length. The slave leaves Eratosthenes in Alexandria, Egypt, and goes south about 800 to 1,000 miles to the city of Syene. On Midsummer's Day, the summer solstice, longest day of the year, they find a completely flat place at noon, and they measure the shadow. Then the slave returns. Well, at Syene, the shadow is like this. In Alexandria, the shadow is like this. Why? Because the Earth is curved. The source of the light up here is going to make a shorter shadow nearer to the equator than it will farther north. Eratosthenes uses these figures to come up with a world map that's going to be used by Columbus, the Claudius Ptolemy map. And it's amazing how accurate the world map is. But the Ptolemy map that Columbus is aware of is only 3/5 the size of the Earth. You can see Asia, Africa, Europe. You can see all of the old world. You can even see India bulging down. Why isn't it the right size? Well, what measurement can't Eratosthenes be certain of? Yeah?
I don't know about North America, like everything.
Yeah, they underestimate the Americas and part of the Pacific. Why? Well, Eratosthenes knows precisely how long the shadows are and how long the sticks are, and can use geometry to do those as part of his equation. But what Eratosthenes doesn't know is the exact distance between Alexandria, Egypt, and Syene. He has to guess that. And his guesstimation underestimates the size of the Earth. It's 3/5 the size that it actually is in this map. And the result of that is Columbus really thought that he would get to Asia, and he really thought that Cuba was part of the East Indies, and it wasn't. It was part of the West Indies. And we call or have called, the natives of the Americas Indians as a result of that mistake. Los Indios, the people of the Indies, is what Columbus called them, because he thought he was in what we would today call Indonesia, Sumatra and Java, and he wasn't. But it had to do with Eratosthenes' underestimation. Archimedes takes a bath. He wants to figure out water displacement. So he fills an entire tub. He weighs himself precisely. He carefully gets into the tub. The tub goes slosh. He gets out of the tub, measures how much water is left. And this is all as a result of a eureka moment, an epiphany, where Archimedes figures out how he can determine water displacement. Claudius Ptolemy does the map geometry. Pythagoras is fascinated with triangles, the Pythagorean theory. Do any of you want to make your math teacher proud by speaking the Pythagorean theory? Yes.
A squared plus b squared equals c squared.
A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Correct. And your math teacher should know and be told that she remembered it.
Okay, I'll tell Mr. Steve for you.
Do that. Euclid, on the other hand, is another big geometrician. Geometry is Greek math. I actually prefer geometry to algebra, but I'm not really a math guy. I could never have been a student here because math would have killed me. Still, Euclid says basically an Aristotelian syllogism that's big in geometry. You have 3 lines. If line A and line B are parallel, and if line B and line C are parallel, then line A and line C must be parallel. That is called Euclidean geometry, and it's the basis of all real geometry that we know. But we can't prove that, not in actuality. So there are many horror genre stories by the writer Howard Phillips Lovecraft that are rooted in concepts of non-Euclidean geometry. What if A and B are parallel and B and C are parallel, but A and C are not? What could happen in a world like that? Well, you could lean on a wall in a corner and slip through. It's just non-Euclidean geometry. It's just mind-blowing. It doesn't make sense, but it's theoretically possible. In any case, medicine. You got a staff. You got a stake wrapped around the staff. That is the caduceus. It is a symbol of healing, and you'll still see it on hospitals and ambulances, although usually it's the winged staff of one Greek god and the caduceus combined. I forget what the winged staff represents. If any of you know, yeah?
That's Hermes' staff. It's like his traveling. That's why it has the wings.
Okay. So you got Hermes' staff, and you got the caduceus, which is what god?
No,
it's the
Asclepius.
staff Yeah, and that is the one with the snake wrapped around it.
No, Hermes has 2 snakes.
Hermes has 2 snakes,
Asclepius has 1.
Yeah.
and Aeschylus has 1. In any case, some combination of staves, and snakes is the symbol of medicine, and it's inconsistent. Go figure. We're so confused and messed up as people. Hippocrates comes along at a time when medicine is suspect, because doctors are experimenting on their patients to push back the knowledge of science. And patients stop going to doctors with trust because they're afraid their doctors are going to basically say, you're a control group. And they'll give you placebos. So Hippocrates says, no, you can't do that. To save the medical profession, I'm going to set up a series of oaths that we make to the gods in most solemn fashion. The first oath is, first, do no harm. Whatever a doctor does, if they take the Hippocratic Oath, they have sworn not to use their power for harm. That whatever they do should be an attempt to help. Do no harm. And that is a huge principle of medicine. And what it's supposed to do is separate out experimental test subjects, which are necessary, I admit, from patients who come to doctors for healing. First, do no harm. Galen maps the body. And Galen comes up with the concept of the four humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. And the idea is that these are in balance, make a person healthy. But the idea of the four humors is behind bleeding, which was a concept practiced by European medieval doctors, among others. The idea is you have too much blood. You have an excess of blood. So what you do is you take a razor and you slice into somebody's veins. Not their arteries! You slice into somebody's arteries, they're going to bleed out and die. You slice into their veins, and you put a leech on them, and the leech sucks out the bad humors by sucking out the excess blood and rebalancing the four humors. This was considered medical science until the 15 and 1600s in the West. So if you ever go to the Middle Ages, don't go to a doctor, because if you're sick, they'll bleed you, which from our perspective is absolutely stupid, because if you give somebody blood loss, they're going to get weaker. Drama. You've got the tragedians, Aeschylus and Sophocles. Sophocles' most famous play is Oedipus. And Oedipus is the story of a Greek coming home to Thebes. And on his way home to Thebes, he meets a guy named Laius who tries to rob him on the road, and he kills Laius. Then he arrives in Thebes, Oedipus does, and the Thebans are ruled by a queen, Jocasta, and they're plagued by a sphinx who is destroying the children and the people of Thebes. So Oedipus accepts a commission from Jocasta to destroy the sphinx, and he does. And Jocasta, whose husband has disappeared, marries Oedipus. She's older than him. And years pass, and then Thebes comes under another curse, and it is discovered that, Laius was the father of Oedipus. Jocasta, his wife, was the mother of Oedipus. Oedipus has been sleeping with his mom for years and is married to her. Yeah! That's the curse. And rather than accept the destruction that the gods offer, Oedipus carves out his own eyes to try to punish himself for what the gods did to him. And it's a horror show. So, and there is a story called Electra, which is the similar story, but with the girl and the guys replaced. In any event, that's tragedy. In Greek comedy, you've got Euripides and Aristophanes. The most famous Greek comedy is Aristophanes' The Birds, which Greek comedy is not the same as our comedy. Literature. Homer, of course, you know, Iliad and Odyssey. Hesiod writes a book called Works and Days, which is sort of half travelogue, half history, half mythology. I guess they're thirds. And Aesop tells his myths, like the fox and the grapes. Fox wants the grapes, really wants the grapes, but can't get them. Oh, they're sour grapes anyway. Tortoise and the hare have a race. The hare doesn't take it seriously, goes to sleep on the side of the road. The tortoise boom, 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 passes him by and wins, because slow and steady wins the race. Sports, you got the Olympic Games and the marathon. Olympics are every 4 years. The Greeks come together in peace and they compete athletically. And history, you've got Herodotus, who writes about the Persian Wars, and he is historical, not mythological, but he does broad cultural study. Thucydides, on the other hand, writes about his own experiences in the war, the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides. Herodotus is like a good complex wine. Thucydides is like a cold glass of water. Then there's Xenophon, who writes the story that inspires Alexander's conquest of Persia. Xenophon writes about the 10,000 mercenaries who are hired by Cyrus. They go deep into the Persian Empire, one of the later Cyruses, and then the king is killed, and they've got to fight their way out. And 10,000 Greek mercenaries fight their way from the center of Iraq all the way back to Greece. This shows Persia is weak, and it encourages Alexander's father, Philip of Macedon, and Alexander to come in. Finally, happiness, according to the ancient Greeks, happiness is the exercise of vital powers along lines of excellence in a life afforded scope. There's a little quote just before the maps at the bottom of the page. The exercise of vital powers along lines of excellence, that means no compromise, in a life affording scope. That to the Greeks is happiness. So, tomorrow you have your exam. It's on everything we've done in ancient Greece, including all of this. Study what you need to. Any last questions? Good luck. Did you have a question? Okay. And thank you at home.